You never look the Alpha King in the eye, and you certainly never claim to know him. He is a ruthless conqueror, a monster to be feared by all. But when Martha, a lowly laundry maid, finally looked up at his grand portrait in the manor hall, her heart stopped. Those terrifying, ice-cold eyes. She knew them. They belonged to the shivering, fragile boy she used to share her blanket with 12 years ago. The wash basin slipped from her trembling hands, shattering the quiet room. And before she could swallow the impossible truth, her voice cracked through the dead silence. That boy lived with me in the orphanage. The laughter of the other servants instantly died. The entire hall froze. And the Alpha King was arriving tomorrow. The washing water had gone cold, but Martha did not notice. She stood at the iron tub, hands stilled in the suds, staring at the portrait that hung at the far end of the servants' dining hall. It had been there for years, she knew. She had passed it 100 times without a second glance. But tonight, with the low candles flickering and the autumn wind rattling the shutters, she looked at it properly for the first time. And the face looking back at her was the face of the boy she had once shared a cot with. "That boy lived with me in the orphanage," she cried out, her voice cracking against the stone walls. The other servants turned. A few laughed. Old Bess, who had been at the manor for 40 years, squinted at the portrait and then at Martha, and shook her head with the weary patience of someone who had heard too many wild claims in her lifetime. "You've been reading too many stories, girl," Bess said. "That's the Alpha King. His portrait has hung there since before you were born. What would a king be doing in a St. Margaret's orphanage?" Martha set the wet linen down slowly. Her hands were trembling, and she pressed them flat against her apron to still them. She had not thought about that boy in years. She had locked those memories away in a chest with rusted hinges, the way you lock away a pair of shoes that no longer fit, but that you cannot bear to throw out. But now the chest had been thrown open, and the memories came spilling out over the cold stone floor of the servants' hall. She remembered the winter of her 7th year. The orphanage had been full to bursting that season, and the beds had run out before the children had. The youngest ones were doubled up, 2 to a mattress, and Martha had been paired with a quiet boy with dark hair and serious eyes. His name, I think, is Edward. He had been at St. Margaret's for longer than anyone could remember, though no one knew exactly how he had come to be there. Mother Agnes said he had been left at the gate, wrapped in a woolen blanket that was finer than anything the other children owned. Edward had not spoken much at first. He had sat on the edge of the cot for 3 days without saying a word, watching the other children play as if they were creatures from another world. Martha had been too shy to talk to him, and he had been too guarded to invite conversation. They had shared the same mattress for a week before he had spoken to her at all. It had been the night of the great frost. Martha remembered it because the wind had howled through the cracks in the walls, and the thin blanket they shared had not been enough to keep either of them warm. She had been shivering so hard that her teeth chattered, and she had been trying very hard not to cry, because crying in the orphanage was a luxury that no one could afford. And then, without a word, Edward had shifted closer and draped half of his blanket over her shoulders. "You're cold," he had said. It was not a question. Martha had been too surprised to answer. She had simply looked at him in the dim light of the dying fire, and he had looked back, and something had passed between them that she had never quite found words for. Not friendship, exactly. Not kinship. Something quieter. Something that said, "We are both alone in this place, and that is easier to bear when there are 2 of us." They had been inseparable after that, not in the loud, laughing way of children who chase each other through the yard. They were quiet companions, the kind who sit side by side without needing to speak. He had taught her how to whittle, and she had taught him, to tell which berries were safe to eat in the hedgerows beyond the garden wall. He had a scar on his left arm, a long, pale line that ran from his elbow to his wrist, and when she had asked about it, he had shrugged and said he did not remember. She had never asked again. And then, in the spring of her 8th year, a carriage had come to St. Margaret's. It was the finest carriage Martha had ever seen, black lacquered wood with silver trim, and it was drawn by 4 horses the color of midnight. A man in a long coat had stepped out, and he had spoken to Mother Agnes for a long time in the front parlor, and when he had come out, he had looked at Edward and nodded. Edward had left that afternoon. He had not said goodbye to Martha. She had watched from the dormitory window as he climbed into the carriage without looking back, and she had waited for him to turn, to wave, to give her some sign that he remembered the nights they had shared their blankets and their secrets. But the carriage had rolled down the long drive, and the gates had swung shut, and Edward had been gone. She had cried for 3 days. Mother Agnes had found her in the pantry on the 3rd day, and had held her without saying a word. And when Martha had finally stopped crying, Mother Agnes had said, "Some children are meant for greater things, my dear, and some are meant to hold the memory of them." "You're white as a sheet, girl." Martha blinked. Bess was standing in front of her now, a rough hand on her shoulder, peering at her with concern. "Did you hear me?" Bess said. "I asked if you were feeling poorly." "I'm fine," Martha said, but her voice came out thin and far away. I was surprised. That's all." "Surprised by a portrait you've walked past every day for 2 years." Martha opened her out. Thank and answer, but no words came. How could she explain? How could she tell Bess that the stern-faced man in the portrait, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, ruler of a domain that stretched from the Thornwood to the Grey Hills, was the same boy who had once shared his blanket with her on a frozen night, the same boy who had taught her to whittle a bird out of a scrap of pine, the same boy who had left without looking back? "Leave her be," said one of the other maids, a girl named Polly who was kind but not curious. "She's probably just tired. We've all been working since dawn." Bess gave Martha one more long look, then shrugged and returned to her seat at the long table. The other servants slowly went back to their dinner, the moment of excitement already fading into the ordinary rhythm of the evening. But Martha stood where she was, frozen, her hands still pressed against her apron, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried to tell herself that she was mistaken. It had been 12 years, after all. The boy she remembered had been 8 years old, all sharp elbows and serious eyes. The man in the portrait was older, harder, his jaw sharp and his eyes heavy with the weight of command. 12 years could change a person beyond recognition. But the eyes were the same. She would have known those eyes anywhere. They were the same deep gray-green, the color of the sea before a storm, and they held the same quiet watchfulness that she remembered from 100 nights shared on a narrow cot. "Mrs. Whitlow is looking for you." Martha turned. Polly was at her elbow, a basket of mending in her arms. "She wants you in the linen room," Polly said something about the new sheets for the guest wing. "The guest wing?" Martha said, her voice catching. "They're prepared." "The fine with it," Polly said, lowering her voice. "The Alpha King is coming back to the estate. He's been away for years, but he's returning for the harvest feast, and Mrs. Whitlow wants everything perfect. You know how she is." Martha felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. The Alpha King was coming back. Edward was coming back. After 12 years, after a lifetime of trying to forget him, he was coming back to the very place where she had been hiding from her past. "Are you all right?" Polly asked, frowning. "You really do look pale." "I'm fine," Martha said, forcing the words out. "I'll go see Mrs. Whitlow." She gathered her wet linens and made her way out of the servants' hall, her legs moving mechanically beneath her. The corridor was dim, lit only by the occasional wall sconce, and the stones were cold beneath her worn shoes. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, trying to keep her thoughts from spinning. He would not recognize her. That was what she told herself. She'd been a child when he left. She was a woman now, with calloused hands and a lifetime of hard work etched into her face. There was no reason for him to look at her and see the girl who had once shared his bed and his secrets. But she would know him. She would know him the moment she saw him, and she did not know if she could bear it. The linen room was at the end of the corridor, a small, stuffy chamber that smelled of lavender and old cloth. Mrs. Whitlow was there, a thin, sharp-eyed woman with iron-gray hair and a mouth that seemed permanently set in disapproval. She looked up as Martha entered, and her eyes narrowed. "There you are," she said. "I've been waiting." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Martha said, dipping her head. "I was in the washroom." "You're always in the washroom," Mrs. Whitlow said, but the nath, Theo, who was no real bite in her voice. She was strict, but not unkind. "The sheets for the master bedroom need to be aired and pressed before the weekend. The Alpha King arrives on Friday, and I want everything ready." "Friday," Martha repeated. "That's right. And I want you to make sure the linens in the East Wing are all fresh as well. He'll be staying there, and I want no complaints." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Whitlow handed her a stack of folded sheets, and Martha took them, her hands steady despite the turmoil inside her. She had been a servant long enough to know how to hide her feelings. She had learned that lesson in the orphanage, long before she had ever come to the manor, and it had served her well. "You look feverish," Mrs. Whitlow said, studying her. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm just tired, ma'am. I'll be fine." Mrs. Whitlow gave her a long, appraising look, then nodded. "See that you are. I can't have you collapsing in the middle of the preparations. We have a great deal to do before the king arrives." "Yes, ma'am." Martha curtsied and left the linen room, the stack of sheets clutched against her chest. She walked down the corridor, past the portrait that had shaken her so badly, and she did not look at it. She did not want to see those gray-green eyes again. She did not want to remember the boy who had left without saying goodbye. But the memory followed her anyway, as it had always done, and she knew that no matter how hard she tried to outrun it, it would be waiting for her when she stopped. Friday. The Alpha King was coming on Friday, and Martha had nowhere to run. The morning came too quickly, and with it, the noise. Martha had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the portrait again, those gray-green eyes, that set jaw that had once been a boy's fact face. She had lain awake in the narrow servant's bed, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, and she had told herself that she would simply stay out of the way. The Alpha King would be busy with the Lord and the steward. He would not wander into the laundry or the kitchen. She could be invisible, as she had always been, but Miss Whitlow had other plans. "Bess, Martha, you'll take the East Wing this morning," the housekeeper said, handing each of them a sack of folded linen. "The king's chambers need fresh sheets, fresh towels, and the hearth needs to be laid. The last guests left the windows open, and the whole room smells of damp." She fixed Martha with a pointed look. "I want it spotless before midday. He arrives this afternoon." Martha's throat tightened. "The East Wing, ma'am?" "You heard me. Don't look so pale. It's just a room." It was not just a room. It was the room where the Alpha King would sleep. It was the room where he would stand and breathe and perhaps look out the window at the same garden she had walked through 100 times. And she would be there, just a servant, just a maid with a stack of linen and a face he had once known better than his own. She followed Bess up the narrow back staircase, her hands trembling slightly around the sheets. Bess, mercifully, was talking. About the harvest, about the new stable boy, about anything that did not require Martha to speak. Martha nodded at the right moments and kept her eyes on the worn stone steps. The East Wing was grander than anything Martha had ever cleaned. The ceiling was painted with clouds and cherubs, and the windows were tall enough to let in the whole gray autumn sky. The bed was enormous, carved from dark oak with posts thick as her arm. Bess set to work on the windowsill, humming Wadi Awful. Martha stripped the old sheets and began to make the bed. It was just a bed. She had made 100 beds. But as she smoothed the linen over the mattress, she could not stop thinking about the narrow cot in the orphanage, and how she and Edward had learned to share it without falling off the edge. He had always lain on the outside, closest to the draft, because he said she felt the cold more. She had never told him that she only pretended to shiver, so he would share the blanket. She had been so small then, so sure that he would always be there. "Martha! Martha!" Bess's voice cut through the memory. "Are you going to stand there hugging that pillow all morning?" Martha blinked. "Sorry, I was just checking the seam." Bess gave her a knowing look, but said nothing. They worked in silence for a while, dusting and polishing, until the room gleamed. The fire was laid, the towels were stacked, and the fresh sheets were tucked so tight you could bounce a coin off them. Martha stood back to admire her work, and for a moment she felt a small, foolish pride. Then she heard it. Horses. Many horses. And wheels, and men's voices calling orders, and the heavy clang of the gate being opened wide. Bess rushed to the window. "He's here! Oh, Martha, he's here. Look at the horses, would you look at them? Black as coal, everyone. And the carriage! She grabbed Martha's arm and pulled her to the window. There's the king's banner, the wolf and the oak. I've never seen it in person, only on the flags in the hall. Martha looked down at the courtyard. The carriage was enormous, black lacquered wood with gold trim, drawn by 6 horses. Footmen in livery were already opening the door. She saw a boot first, a tall black boot, polished to a mirror shine, and then the man himself stepped out. He told her than she remembered. Of course he was. He was a man now, not a boy. He wore a dark coat with silver embroidery, and his hair was darker than it had been in the orphanage, cut short and neat. He stood for a moment, surveying the courtyard with the calm, unhurried authority of someone who had never once doubted his place in the world. And then he turned. And for one terrible, heart-stopping second, Martha thought he looked directly up at the window where she stood. She stumbled back, pulling Bess with her. He saw us? He saw the window, Martha, not us. We're too small to see from down there. Bess laughed, but she was bouncing on her heels with excitement. Oh, he's handsome, isn't he? They say he's never married. They say he's been busy with wars and treaties and all manner of kingly things. She lowered her voice. And they say he has a temper. Mrs. Whitlow told cook that he once dismissed an entire staff for serving him cold soup. Martha swallowed. We should finish the room. Finish it? It's finished. We should go down and watch him come in. Bess grabbed her hand. Come on. We can stand at the back of the hall. No one will notice us. Martha allowed herself to be pulled. She told herself it would be fine. He was a king. He would not look at a maid. He would walk past her as if she were part of the furniture, and that would be the end of it. She would see him once, and then she could go back to the laundry and the memory would finally be sealed away. The great hall was already filling with servants and minor officials, all pressed against the walls to make way for the procession. Martha found a spot near the back, half hidden behind a tall potted fern. Bess stood beside her, craning her neck to see. The doors swung open, and the Alpha King walked in. He moved through the hall like a man who owned every stone of it, because he did. He nodded to the steward, said a few quiet words to the lord of the manor, and his voice carried the same deep, calm timbre she remembered from the nights when he would tell her stories to keep her from crying. But the boy she remembered had been soft and quick to smile. This man's face was carved from stone, his eyes moving over the crowd without landing on anyone. He was almost past her when he stopped. Martha's heart seized. He had paused just a few feet away, and he was frowning. Not at her, not at anyone in particular, but at something. He turned his head slightly as if he had caught a scent on the air or a half-remembered sound. Her breath caught in her throat. She clutched the ferns so hard she felt a leaf snap. Then one of his aides stepped forward and murmured something about the east wing, and the Alpha King nodded, and the moment passed. He continued walking, his boots echoing on the stone floor, and he did not look back. Martha exhaled. Her hands were shaking. Did you see that? Bess whispered. He stopped. Why did he stop? I don't know, Martha said, and her voice came out thin and strange. Maybe he was just looking at the hall? Bess did not look convinced, but the crowd was already dispersing, and there was work to be done. Martha followed her back toward the servants' quarters, her mind racing. He had not seen her. He had not recognized her. He had simply paused for no reason she could name, and then moved on. She should have felt relieved. But as she walked down the corridor, she passed the portrait again. That same gray-green gaze, that same quiet intensity, and she could not shake the feeling that he had sensed something, that some part of him, buried deep in the years and the wars and the crown, had stirred at the scent of her. She told herself it was foolishness. She told herself that kings did not remember orphan girls, but when she reached the laundry and picked up the next pile of sheets, her hands were still trembling, and she knew that the worst was not over. Tomorrow was the feast, and Mrs. Whitlow had already informed her in that brisk, no-nonsense voice that all servants would be required to attend the hall and wait on the guests. There would be no hiding then. Martha pressed the cool linen against her hot cheeks and tried to remember how to breathe. The boy she had known had been gentle and kind, and he had left without a word. The man he had become was a stranger, a king, a power she could not even begin to understand, but he had stopped. In the middle of his own grand entrance, he had stopped, and she could not decide if that was a miracle or a warning. The morning came too quickly, as if the night had barely drawn breath before the light spilled over the hills. Martha woke before the bells, as she always did, but this time she did not linger in her narrow bed. She pulled on her work dress, laced her boots, and slipped out of the servants' quarters while the rest of the house still slept. She told herself she was going to the kitchen to start the laundry water. She told herself that the path to the wash-house simply happened to pass by the stable-yard, but her feet knew better, and they carried her to the low wooden fence that bordered the stables where the morning mist clung to the cobblestones like a secret. The black stallion stood in the third stall, its head lowered over the feed trough. Even from a distance, Martha could see the way it favored its left foreleg, the hoof lifted just slightly off the ground, as if the animal itself had learned to hide its pain. A king's horse, she thought, trained to show no weakness. The thought made her chest ache in a way she did not care to examine. She had brought nothing, she had not planned this, and yet here she was, standing at the edge of the stable-yard at dawn, watching a horse she had no business tending. The stable-boy, a freckled lad of perhaps 14 named Tom, emerged from the tack room with a bucket of water. He blinked at her, surprised. "Martha, you're up early." "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was true enough. She nodded toward the stall. "Is his leg any better?" Tom set the bucket down and rubbed the back of his neck. "The swelling's gone down some, but he's still favouring it. The farrier said it's a stone bruise, needs rest and a poultice. I was going to change the dressing after I fed the other horses." Martha hesitated. The sensible thing was to nod, wish him well, and continue on to the wash-house. The sensible thing was to remember her place. She was a laundry maid, not a stable hand, and the last thing she needed was to be caught lingering near the Alpha King's personal mount. But the horse had lifted its head now, and it was looking at her with those deep, patient eyes, and Martha found herself unlatching the gate before she had fully decided to do so. "I can change the poultice," she heard herself say. "I used to help with the horses at the orphanage. The old mare we had there, she got a stone bruise once, and the stable-master showed me how to pack it." Tom looked relieved. "You know how to do it proper?" "Proper enough." He handed her the cloth-wrapped bundle of herbs and the clean bandages without further argument. "I'll be in the tack room if you need me. The stallion's called Storm, by the way. He's a gentle thing once he knows you're not a threat, Storm. Of course, a king would name his horse something grand and untouchable." Martha stepped into the stall slowly, letting the animal see her, letting it catch her scent before she moved any closer. The stallion's ears flicked forward, watchful but not alarmed. "Hello, Storm," she murmured, keeping her voice low and even. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." She crouched beside the injured leg, her hands moving with a carefulness that surprised even herself. The poultice was still damp, but it had shifted, leaving the bruised area partly exposed. She peeled it back gently, checking for signs of heat or swelling, and when she found none worse than before, she packed a fresh layer of herbs against the hoof and wrapped the bandage snug and neat. The stallion stood perfectly still through it all, its breath warm and steady against her shoulder. When she finished and rose to her feet, it nuzzled her sleeve as if thanking her, and Martha felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since yesterday afternoon. "There now," she said softly. "That's better, isn't it? You have a way with him." The voice came from the stable doorway, low and quiet, and Martha's heart stopped. She turned slowly, her hands still smelling of herbs and horse, and found herself looking at the Alpha King. He was not dressed in the formal finery of yesterday's arrival. Instead, he wore a simple linen shirt and leather riding boots, his dark hair still damp from washing, and he looked, for a brief and disorienting moment, less like a king and more like the boy she had once known. He was standing in the shadow of the stable door, watching her with an expression she could not read. "My lord," she said, and dropped into a quick "Fati," her face burning. "I didn't mean to intrude, I was just— the stable boy said the poultice had shifted and I— You helped him." He stepped into the stable, his presence filling the space in a way that made the air feel thinner. Tom is good with the horses, but he's young, and his hands are not always as careful as they should be. "I saw you from the window. You were gentle with him." Martha did not know what to say. She had not expected to be seen. She had not expected to be noticed at all. "Storm doesn't take to strangers," Edward continued, and there was something almost curious in his voice now, a thread of wonder beneath the calm. "He bit the farrier yesterday, drew blood, and yet he stood there and let you touch his leg as if you had been doing it all his life." "He's a good horse," Martha managed. He just needed someone to be patient with him. Edward was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, steady and searching, and she kept her own eyes fixed on the stallion's mane, afraid of what he might see if she looked up. "Have we met before?" he asked, and the question hung in the air between them like a half-remembered song. Martha's throat tightened. She could have said yes. She could have said, "I am Martha, the girl who shared her bread with you in the orphanage, the girl who held your hand when the nightmares came, the girl you left without a word." She could have said all of it and watched his face for any flicker of recognition, but she did not. "No, my lord," she said quietly. "I'm just a laundry maid. You would have no reason to remember me." Edward frowned, as if the answer did not quite satisfy him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but at that moment Tom emerged from the tack room, a bridle over his shoulder, and the spell was broken. Edward stepped back, his expression smoothing into the familiar mask of command. "See, that Storm is given extra hay tonight," he said to Tom, and then, with a final glance at Martha, he turned and walked out of the stable. Martha stood there for a long time after he was gone, her hands trembling at her sides. He had asked if they had met. He had almost remembered. And she had lied. Because the truth was too heavy to place in the hands of a man who had become a king. She finished her work in the stable, washed her hands at the pump, and made her way to the wash-house, where the laundry was already piled high, and Mrs. Whitlow was waiting with her arms crossed. "There you are," the housekeeper said, but her tone was not unkind. "I've been looking for you. The Alpha King's steward stopped by this morning. He wants a maid assigned to attend the king personally during the feast tonight. Someone quiet, discreet, who won't chatter or fuss." "I thought of you." Martha stared at her. "Me? You're the most sensible of the laundry girls, and you don't have the look of someone who'd faint at the sight of a king." Mrs. Whitlow paused, studying her with a shrewd eye. "Is there a problem?" "No," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No problem." "Good. Report to the Great Hall 2 hours before the feast. Wear your best apron, and mind your manners." The housekeeper turned and walked away, leaving Martha standing alone in the doorway of the wash-house, the weight of the evening settling over her like a cold shroud. She would be serving him tonight. She would be standing close enough to pour his wine, to refill his plate, to hear his voice when he spoke to the other guests. And he had already looked at her once with that hint of a question in his eyes. She did not know how she would survive the evening. She did not know if she wanted him to remember her or if she wanted him to forget. But as she picked up the first pile of linens and began the day's work, she found herself thinking of the stallion, and the way it had stood so still and trusting while she tended its wound. And she thought, perhaps, that there was something to be said for being patient with the things that were afraid of being hurt. The feast was coming, and whatever it brought, she would face it the only way she knew how, one careful step at a time. The great hall blazed with 100 candles, their flames dancing in the draughts that crept through the high, arched windows. Martha stood against the far wall, her hands clasped in front of her, watching the lords and ladies of the northern court settle into their seats along the long oak tables. The air smelled of roasted venison and spiced wine, of wood smoke and expensive perfume. It was a world she had only ever glimpsed from the edges. She had been given a clean apron and a white cap that pinched behind her ears. Mrs. Whitlow had inspected her twice before the doors opened, adjusting the fall of her sleeves and muttering about the importance of not spilling anything on the Alpha King's doublet. Martha had nodded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, that would not have betrayed the trembling in her hands. She had not eaten since breakfast. Her stomach had been too tight with dread, and now it was too tight with something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. The doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the murmur of conversation fell away. Edward walked in with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. His dark hair was brushed back from his face, and hot feet were a deep green tunic embroidered with the silver wolf of his house. He looked taller than she remembered, broader across the shoulders, and when his eyes swept the room she felt them pause on her for just a breath before moving on. He took his seat at the head of the central table, and the lords and ladies followed, settling into their places with the rustle of fine fabric and the scrape of chairs. A steward gestured to Martha, and she crossed the hall with her eyes fixed on the floor, feeling every step like a drum beat in her chest. She was to stand behind his chair. She was to pour his wine when his cup ran low, and to step forward when he gestured. She was to be invisible, as servants were meant to be. She took her place behind him, close enough to see the silver threads in his collar, close enough to catch the scent of soap and cedar that clung to his skin. Her hands trembled, and she pressed them together until the trembling stopped. The feast began with soup, a rich broth of mushrooms and barley that steamed in the cold air. Martha watched the other servants move along the tables, refilling cups and clearing plates with practiced efficiency. She tried to remember the order of things, the way Mrs. Whitlow had explained it. Pour when the cup is low. Step back. Do not speak unless spoken to. She did not have to wait long. Edward finished his soup and set the bowl aside, and she stepped forward to refill his cup with the dark red wine. Her hand was steady as she poured, and she was careful not to let the lip of the flagon touch the rim of the cup. She stepped back. He did not look at her. The meal progressed. Roasted venison with juniper berries, a dish of root vegetables glazed in honey, fresh bread still warm from the ovens. Martha moved when she was needed, phoned when his cup was low, and kept her eyes carefully lowered. She heard the conversation flow around her, the talk of harvests and hunting and the border disputes with the southern lords. She had almost begun to relax when a voice at the far end of the table spoke up, loud and rough with age. "Your Grace, I heard a curious thing the other day. They say the orphanage in the northern hills was closed down some years back, the one that used to take in the children of the old wars." Mara's blood went cold. She kept her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the far wall. She did not look at the speaker. She did not look at Edward. "The old Stonebridge orphanage," the old lord continued, stroking his gray beard. "My wife's cousin served on its board. Said they sent the children out to various houses when it closed. A shame, really. Some of those children had good blood in them." Martha felt the words land like stones in her chest. Good blood. She had heard those words before, in a different voice, in a different time. She had been 10 years old, standing in line with the other children while the visitors walked past, looking at them the way one looked at horses at a market. She had not been chosen that day. She had been too small, too thin, too plain. She had watched the others leave with their new families, and she had told herself she did not mind. She had minded terribly. "Stonebridge," Edward said, and his voice cut through her memory like a blade. "I remember it." The table went quiet. Martha's heart stopped. Edward set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I was there for a time, when I was a boy, before I was brought to my father's house. It was a cold place, but it was not unkind." The old lord blinked. "Your Grace was at Stonebridge." "For a short time," Edward said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something careful. "I do not speak of it often, but I remember it." Martha could not breathe. She stood behind his chair, her hands frozen, her eyes fixed on the wall. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, pulling her back to that cold stone building with its narrow beds and its thin porridge. She remembered a boy with dark hair and a fierce protective glare. She remembered the way he had stood between her and the older children when they had taken her blanket. She had never learned his name. She had never been brave enough to ask. And now she was standing behind him, pouring his wine, and he was talking about Stonebridge as if it were a distant memory, and she did not know if she was going to cry or faint or both. "The children were well cared for, I believe," the old lord said. "Given the circumstances. They were given what could be given," Edward said. "And what could not be given, they learned to do without." He said it quietly, but Martha heard the edge in it. She had heard that same edge in her own voice, more times than she could count. It was the voice of someone who had learned early that the world did not owe them anything, and that the only way to survive was to ask for nothing and take what they could. She wanted to speak. She wanted to say something, anything, to let him know that she remembered, that she had never forgotten the boy who had stood between her and the darkness. But she could not, because she was a maid, and he was the Alpha King, and the distance between those two things was wider than the sea. The feast continued. The old lord moved on to other topics, and the conversation drifted back to harvests and hunting. Martha Kipter stood behind Edward's chair and poured his wine and kept her face perfectly still, but her hands were shaking. She felt his gaze on her once, twice, 3 times. She did not meet it. She kept her eyes on the wall, on the floor, on the flame of the nearest candle, anywhere but him. The meal ended with a course of sweet pies and candied fruit, and then the guests began to rise, drifting toward the great fireplace where the servants had laid out cups of spiced mead. Martha stepped back, intending to slip away to the kitchens before anyone noticed her. She had taken 2 steps when his voice stopped her. Martha. The sound of her name in his mouth was like a hand closing around her throat. She turned slowly, her heart hammering. He was still seated at the head of the table, his cup in his hand, his eyes fixed on her. The candlelight caught the sharp lines of his face, the shadows under his eyes, the faint tension in his jaw. "You were at Stonebridge," he said. It was not a question. The words hung between them like a held breath. Martha's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The lie was there, ready on her tongue. She could say no. She could say she did not know what he meant. She could say she had been taken in by a farm family as an infant and had never known any orphanage. But the lie would not come, because she had seen the boy who stood between her and the darkness, and she had never forgotten him. I was there," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "For a time, when I was young." Edward set down his cup. He did not look away from her. "How long?" "A few years," she swallowed. "I was brought there when I was 8. I left when I was 11. His eyes narrowed. "And then?" "I was taken in by a washerwoman in the southern villages. She taught me her trade. When she passed, I made my way here. And you have been here since?" 3 weeks. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the voices of the guests drifted across the hall, distant and muffled. "I remember a girl," he said slowly, "at Stonebridge. She used to sing to herself, when she thought no one was listening. Soft songs, old songs. The other children used to gather around her at night, just to hear her." Martha's throat closed. "She was small," Edward said, "too small for her age. The bigger children used to take her things, and she never fought back. She would just sit there and let them." His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, something like recognition. "There was a boy," he said, "a boy who used to stand between her and the others. He would take back her blanket, her bread, her shoes. He never told her his name." Martha could not speak. The tears were burning behind her eyes, and she could not blink them away fast enough. "She used to sing to him too," Edward said, "at night when he could not sleep. She would sit on the floor beside his cot and sing until the darkness did not seem so heavy." A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, quickly, before anyone could see. "That girl," Edward said, and his voice was rough now, unsteady. "That girl was you." It was not a question, it was a statement, a recognition, a door opening that she had spent 12 years trying to keep closed. Martha stood there, in the middle of the great hall, with the candles burning and the guests laughing and the whole world spinning around her, and she could not find the words to deny it. "I remember," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. "I remember you." Edward rose from his chair. He neared a step toward her, then stopped. The distance between them was still too wide, but it was smaller than it had been a moment ago. "You lied to me," he said, "this morning in the stables. You told me we had never met." "I was afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of this." She gestured between them, at the great hall and the fine clothes, and the impossible distance between a washerwoman and a king. "Of being reminded of what I was, of what I could never be." Edward was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "You were never what you could never be. You were the only thing in that place that was worth remembering." Martha's breath caught. "And I have spent 12 years, he said, wondering what happened to the girl who used to sing to me at night." The tears were falling freely now, and she did not try to stop them. "I am here," she said. "I am here." Edward looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small, private smile that softened the hard lines of his face. "So you are," he said. "So you are." and somewhere in the great hall a log shifted in the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The guests kept talking, the candles kept burning, and the world kept turning. But for Martha, standing in the middle of the feast with the Alpha King looking at her like she was the only person in the room, the world had come to a standstill. She had been seen, and for the first time in 12 years, she did not want to hide. The guests did not leave all at once. They drifted, in twos and threes, toward the great doors, their voices humming with wine and gossip. Martha stood where Edward had left her, her hands clasped in front of her apron, watching the fire burn low in the hearth. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the candles to bellow a gutter and drip, long enough for the serving girls to begin gathering the empty cups, long enough for Mrs. Whitlow to give her a long, unreadable look from across the hall before turning away, and then a servant appeared at her elbow, quiet as a mouse. "His Majesty asks that you follow me, miss." Martha's heart stumbled. She looked toward the high table, but the chair where Edward had sat was empty. The servant was already moving toward a side door, and she had no choice but to follow. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by a few wall sconces. The servant led her past the kitchens, past the storerooms, past the little chapel where the castle folk said their prayers. And then, at the end of a narrow passage, the servant stopped and gestured to a heavy oak door. "He said he would meet you in the garden, through there." Martha pushed the door open. The night air hit her face, cool and clean after the heat of the hall. The garden was small and walled, a place where the castle grew its herbs and a few hardy roses. The moon was up, half full, casting silver light over the neat rows. Edward stood with his back to her, looking up at the sky. For a moment, Martha did not move. She stood in the doorway, watching him. He had taken off the heavy ceremonial cloak, and in the moonlight his shoulders looked less like a king's and more like a man's. 12 years, he said, without turning around. "I asked the sisters at Stonebridge if they knew where you had gone." Martha's throat tightened. She stepped into the garden, letting the door close behind her. "They said the woman who took you in was a washerwoman," Edward continued. "They had no name for her, no direction. You simply vanished." "Her name was Elena," Martha said quietly. "She was kind to me. She taught me everything I know about the work." Edward turned then. In the moonlight his face was hard to read, but his eyes were steady on hers. "Did she treat you well?" "Yes," Martha said. "She had no children of her own. She said the Lord had sent me to her." "Then I owe her a debt I can never repay," Edward said. "Whoever she was," Martha felt her eyes sting. She looked down at her hands. "She died 3 winters ago," she said. "I stayed in her cottage for a while after, doing the washing for the village, but the work was hard and the pay was little, and then I heard the castle was looking for a girl in the laundry. I walked here. It took me 4 days." Edward was silent for a long moment. "You walked 4 days?" he said finally. "To work in a laundry?" "It is honest work," Martha said. "I did not mind it." "I know you did not mind it," Edward said. "That is what I remember about you. You never minded the things you had to do. You just did them, quietly, without complaint." Martha did not know what to say. She had never thought of herself that way. "Come," Edward said, and he began to walk slowly down the path between the herb beds. "Walk with me." She fell into step beside him, a pace behind, the way she had been taught to walk beside someone of rank. But after a few steps, Edward stopped and looked at her. "You do not need to walk behind me," he said. "Not here, not now." Martha hesitated. Then she took a step, so that she walked beside him. They walked in silence for a while. The garden was small, and they reached the far wall quickly, then turned and walked back. "Tell me about the song," Edward said. Martha's steps faltered. "The song? The one you used to sing? At night when the crying was bad." She remembered the dormitory at Stonebridge had been cold in the winter, and smaller children often cried themselves to sleep. She had been one of the older ones, and she had learned that a soft voice, low and steady, could quiet a child faster than a scold. "I made it up," she said. "There was a girl named Lily. She was only 4, and she cried every night for her mother. I started humming to her. After a while I put words to it." "Sing it," Edward said. Martha shook her head. I could not. Why not? Because, she stopped. Because it is a child's song. It is not for kings. Edward stopped walking. He turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see the faint softening around his eyes. It is for me, he said quietly. I was the one who listened to it. Every night, for the months I was there, I never told you I was awake. I never told you I heard it. But I did. Martha stared at him. You were the one who sang to the little ones, Edward said. But you were also the one who sang to a boy who could not sleep because he was afraid of the dark, and afraid of the men who might come for him, and afraid of everything he did not understand. You sang, and the fear went quiet. Do you understand what that meant to me? Martha's lips parted, but no sound came out. I have been in battles, Edward said. I have stood on walls while arrows flew past my head. I have made decisions that kept this kingdom safe, and decisions that kept me awake for nights afterward. But the bravest thing I have ever done was lie still in a cold bed, listening to a girl sing a song she thought no one could hear. The tears came then, sudden and hot, and Martha pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back a sob. Please, she whispered. Please do not say such things to me. I am only a washerwoman. You are not only anything, Edward said. You never were. He took a step closer. They were not touching, but Martha could feel the warmth of him in the cold night air. Sing it for me, he said. Just once. Here, where no one can hear but me. Martha shook her head, but her mouth was already forming the words. The old words. The words she had not sung in years. Hush now, little one. The night is long. Her voice cracked, and she stopped. Edward finished the line. But the stars will keep you till the dawn. Martha stared at him. I know it by heart, he said simply. I have known it for 12 years. When I was in the training yards, I sang it in my head when the work was hard. When I sat in council and the lords argued, I sang it in my head to keep my temper. When I thought I would never see you again, I sang it in my head. And I prayed that wherever you were safe. Martha could not speak. She stood in the moonlit garden, tears streaming down her face, and she felt something break open inside her chest. Edward, she said. It was the first time she had said his name without the title. He did not correct her. Yes, he said. That is my name, and I would hear it from your lips 1,000 times before I die. The words hung between them, raw and real. Martha wiped her face with the back of her hand. You should not say such things to a servant. I should not say such things to anyone but you, Edward said, and I have said nothing of the kind to anyone for years. He reached out, slowly, giving her time to pull away. His fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, then rested there, light as a falling leaf. You are not a servant to me, he said. You are the girl who sang to me in the dark. You are the reason I learned to be brave, and I will not let you hide from me anymore. Martha looked up at him, her heart pounding. How did you find me? She asked. How did you know I was here? I did not know, Edward said. I have been looking for you for years, Martha. I sent word to every town and village in the kingdom, asking after a girl named Martha, a washerwoman, who had been at Stonebridge. I had almost given up hope. But then, he said, I saw you. In the laundry yard 3 weeks ago, I was walking past and I saw a woman hanging sheets on the line, and something in the way she moved made me stop. I stood there for a long moment and I knew. You knew? Martha whispered. I knew, Edward said. I have been trying to find a way to speak to you ever since. I did not want to frighten you. I did not want to presume. But when you lied this morning, I knew you were afraid, and I could not let you go on being afraid. Martha closed her eyes. I was so frightened, she said. I thought, if you remembered me, you would remember the girl who was weak, the girl who never fought back, the girl you had to protect. I did not want you to remember me like that. Edward was quiet for a moment. You think that is how I remember you? He said. You think I remember you as weak? Martha opened her eyes. I remember a girl who was too small to fight, Edward said. Too small to win.
But I also remember a girl who stood between a bully and a little boy who could not defend himself. I remember a girl who was bruised and bleeding, but who did not move. Do you remember that?" Martha's breath caught. She did remember. There had been a boy, a big boy, who had cornered her and pushed her down, and another boy, smaller, had tried to help her, and the big boy had turned on him. She had gotten up, thrown herself between them, and taken the blow meant for the smaller boy. "That was you," she said slowly.
"The boy who tried to help me." "I was not much help," Edward said. "You were braver than I was." "No," Martha said. "You were the only one who ever tried." They stood in the moonlight, and the years between them seemed to fall away. "I have a room," Edward said, his voice careful, almost hesitant. "In the east wing. It has been empty for years. It faces south, and it is warm in the mornings." Martha looked at him, not understanding. "If you wanted," Edward said, "you could move there. Away from the laundry, away from the servants' quarters. Somewhere you do not have to hide." Martha's heart stopped. "Edward," she said, "I am a washerwoman. I cannot live in the east wing." "You can," Edward said, "if you want to." He looked at her, and there was something vulnerable in his eyes, something she had never expected to see in the face of an Alfra king. "You do not have to answer now," he said, "but I want you to know that the offer stands. For as long as you need to think about it, and if you never want to, I will not ask again." Martha opened her mouth, but no words came. "I will walk you back to the servants' quarters," Edward said. "It is late." They walked in silence through the garden, back through the oak door, down the narrow passage. When they reached the corner where the corridors split, Edward stopped. "Good night, Martha," he said. "Good night, Edward." He smiled, that small, private smile, and turned away. Martha stood in the corridor, watching him go, and she felt the weight of the invitation pressing against her chest. The east wing, the room that faced south, she had been seen, she had been remembered, and now she had been offered a place she had never dared to dream of. But as she walked the rest of the way to her narrow bed, she could not help but wonder. Could she really take it? Could she really step out of the shadows into the light and let him see all of her, not just the brave girl who sang, but the woman who had spent 12 years learning to keep her head down and her voice quiet? She lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, the song still humming in her chest. And upstairs in the east wing, Edward stood at his window looking out at the moon, and he did not sleep either. The morning came too soon, gray and damp, and Martha woke with the song still in her head. She lay still for a moment, staring at the cracked plaster above her bed, and she thought of the east wing, the room that faced south. She had not answered him. She had not even tried to answer him. She rose and dressed in the dark, her fingers moving through the familiar motions of the day, the rough wool of her apron, the worn wooden clogs, the kerchief she tied over her hair. 12 years of these motions, 12 years of keeping her head down and her voice quiet. And yet now, for the first time, the quiet felt like a cage. The laundry was already steaming when she arrived. The other women barely looked up as she slipped in through the side door, taking her place at the great stone trough, plunging her hands into the hot, soapy water. The rhythm was a comfort, the way it always was, the rub of cloth against the washboard, the slap of wet linen on the stone, the low murmur of the women's talk around her. But the talk was not the same today. "You heard what happened at the feast," one of them was saying, a young woman named Polly, who had bright eyes and a sharp tongue. "The king called her up from the servants' table, made her stand beside him like she was a lady." Martha kept her eyes on the water. "They say he sent her away with his own guard," Ollie went on, lowering her voice. "And that she was in the garden with him, alone, for nearly an hour." The women exchanged glances. Martha felt their eyes on her back, curious and wary and a little envious all at once. "I heard Mrs. Whitlow was not pleased," another woman said quietly. "She has a temper, that one, and she does not like to share." Martha said nothing.
She scrubbed at a stubborn stain on a linen shirt, pressing her knuckles into the fabric until they ached. She worked through the morning without stopping. She did not let herself think about the East Wing, or the way Edward had looked at her in the moonlight, or the song they had sung together. She did not let herself think about the fact that he had remembered her, that for 12 years, somewhere inside the man who had become Alpha King, there had been a boy who still carried the memory of a girl with a voice like a bell. She was a laundry maid. That was who she was. That was who she had always been. At midday, Mrs. Whitlow appeared at the door of the laundry, her gray silk skirts rustling as she swept inside. She was a tall woman, sharp-featured, with eyes that missed nothing. The women fell silent at once, their hands slowing over their work. "Martha," Mrs. Whitlow said, her voice cool and precise. "The king's private linens need to be aired this afternoon. You will see to it personally, and when you are finished, you will report to the kitchen for the evening shift. There will be no time for rest today." Martha bowed her head. "Yes, Mrs. Whitlow." The older woman stepped closer, her voice dropping so that only Martha could hear. "I do not know what happened last night, girl, and I do not care to know. But I will tell you this. There is no place for you in the East Wing. You are a laundry maid. Remember that." She turned and swept out of the room, leaving the women staring after her in uneasy silence. Martha stood very still, her hands dripping soapy water onto the stone floor. She felt the words settle into her chest like stones. No place for you in the East Wing. She knew it was true. She had known it since the moment Edward had spoken the invitation, standing in the corridor with the moonlight silvering his hair. And yet, she remembered the way he had smiled. That long, private smile meant only for her. She picked up the basket of the king's linens and carried it out into the yard, where the clotheslines hung in long, sagging rows. The air was cool and clean, and the sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting pale gold light across the wet grass. She began to hang the sheets, one by one, her hands moving through the familiar motions. It was there, in the middle of the yard, that the girl found her. She was young, no more than 16, with a soft lined face of someone who had never known a day of real hardship. She wore a pale blue gown trimmed with lace, and her hair was arranged in elaborate curls that must have taken a maid an hour to pin. She stopped a few feet away from Martha, her hands clasped in front of her, and examined the laundry maid with open curiosity. "You are the one," the girl said, "who sang at the feast." Martha kept her eyes on the sheet she was hanging. "I do not know, miss. They say the king called you up from the servant stable. They say he made you stand beside him." The girl tilted her head, her expression not unkind but unbearably condescending. "It must have been strange for you, being so close to someone so far above you." Martha's fingers tightened on the sheet. "It was an honor, miss." "Was it?" The girl smiled, a thin, knowing smile. "I saw you in the garden last night. From my window, you were speaking with him for a long time. I wondered what a laundry-maid could possibly have to say to a king." Martha did not answer. She could not answer. The words caught in her throat like fish hooks. The girl waited a moment, then shrugged and turned away. "Well, I am sure it was nothing. He will forget you by the end of the week. They always do." She walked back toward the castle, her skirts swishing against the grass, leaving Martha alone in the yard with the wind and the wet sheets and the echo of her words. "He will forget you by the end of the week." Martha stood there for a long time, her hands hanging at her sides. She thought of the room that faced south. She thought of the way Edward had said her name, not as a servant's name, but as if it were something precious, something he had been keeping safe for 12 years. And she thought of Mrs. Whitlow's cold voice and the girl's careless cruelty, and the way the other laundry women had looked at her this morning, as if she had already become someone else, someone they did not quite recognize. She was not the brave girl who had sung at the feast. She was not the girl who had stood in the moonlight and looked into a king's eyes. She was a laundry maid with calloused hands and a tired back, and 12 years of learning to keep her head down. But Edward had remembered her. After all this time, after all these years, he had remembered her. She finished hanging the sheets and carried the empty basket back to the laundry. She worked through the afternoon without complaint,
scrubbing and rinsing and wringing, her hands moving through the motions of a life she had built for herself out of silence and endurance. And all the while, the psalm hummed in her chest, soft and persistent like a heartbeat. When the evening bell rang, she did not go to the kitchen. She did not report to Mrs. Whitlow. She set down the wet cloth she had been holding, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out of the laundry. The corridors were quiet, lit by the last gray light of dusk. She climbed the stairs to the great hall, then turned down the long gallery that led to the east wing. Her footsteps echoed on the stone, and she felt her heart pounding against her ribs, loud and unsteady. She had not answered him. She had not even tried to answer him, but she knew, now, what the answer would be. The east wing was warmer than the rest of the castle, its walls lined with tapestries that muffled the sound. The floors were polished wood, not stone, and the air smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. She walked slowly down the corridor, past closed doors and darkened windows, until she reached the door at the end. It was standing open. Light spilled out into the corridor, warm and golden, and standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the glow, was Edward. He did not look surprised to see her. He looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face, and then he stepped aside, making room for her to enter. "You came," he said quietly. Martha stood in the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides. She could see the room beyond him, the bed with its pale blue coverlet, the windows that faced south, the chair by the hearth where the fire crackled softly. And then she saw it. In the corner, near the window, stood a small wooden music stand, and on it rested a child's harp. A small, simple thing, its strings dulled with age, its frame worn smooth in the exact place where small hands would have held it. She had not seen it in 12 years. Thing, I fid. She had not dared to think of it. "That was mine," she breathed. "At the orphanage, that was mine." Edward did not move. "I remember," he said. "You used to play it every evening. After the other children had gone to sleep, you thought no one was listening. But I always listened." Martha walked into the room, her legs unsteady, her eyes fixed on the little harp. She reached out and touched the frame, feeling the familiar smoothness of the wood, the worn place where her thumb had rested all those years ago. "I sent for it," Edward said, his voice soft behind her. "After I found you again, I thought you might want it back." She turned to look at him. The firelight caught his face, softening the hard lines of his jaw, and for a moment she saw the boy he had been, the thin, quiet boy who had sat in the corner of the orphanage, listening to her sing while the other children slept. "You remembered the harp," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "I remember everything," he said. "I remembered the songs. I remembered the way you used to hum when you were nervous. I remembered the day you stood between me and the bigger boys, even though you were smaller than all of them." He took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "I remembered you, Martha. All of it." She felt the tears come then, hot and fast, streaming down her cheeks. She did not try to stop them. She stood in the middle of the room that faced south, her hand resting on the little harp that had been hers, and she let herself cry. "I was afraid," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I was afraid that if I came here, if I let myself believe this was real, I would wake up and find it was all a dream. I am a laundry maid, Edward. I have spent 12 years learning to be invisible. I do not know how to be seen." He crossed the room and took her hands in his fingers warm and steady around hers. "You do not have to know how," he said. "You only have to let me see you. That is all I have ever wanted." Martha looked up at him, into the face of the man who had remembered her, and she felt the fear loosening in her chest, like a knot slowly coming undone. "Then I will stay," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I will stay." Edward closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked very much like hope. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, those calloused, work-roughened knuckles, and said, "Welcome home, Martha." The fire crackled. The little harp stood silent in the corner, and in the room that faced south, Martha let herself begin, at last, to believe. The first morning in the East Wing was not the beginning Martha had imagined. She woke before dawn, as she always had, to the sound of bells from the chapel tower. But instead of the familiar creak of the laundry-room door and the sharp voice of the head laundress calling her to the washboards, there was only the soft crackle of the fire that someone had kept burning through the night. She lay still for a long moment, staring at the tapestried ceiling. The bed was too soft. The sheets smelled of lavender, not of lye and ash. It felt like sleeping in someone else's life. She rose, dressed in the same gray wool dress she had worn for 3 years, and stood at the window. The morning light slanted across the courtyard below. She could see the laundry yard from here, the long stone troughs, the steaming vats, the line of women bending over their work. They were already at it, as they had been every morning since she could remember, and she rose, think up here, watching them from a window that faced south. The guilt caught her by surprise, sharp and unexpected. She turned away from the window. She would go down to the laundry today, as she always did. She would tell Mrs. Whitlow herself that she had not abandoned her post, that she was still the same Martha who had scrubbed the king's shirts until her knuckles bled. Nothing had changed. She would make sure of it. But when she reached the laundry yard, the head laundress looked at her with a strange, careful expression. "Martha," she said not unkindly, "you should go to the kitchen. Mrs. Whitlow has posted a new assignment for you." Martha stopped. "The kitchen?" "She came by before first bell. Said you were being reassigned to the scullery under cook's orders. Something about a change in your duties." A cold knot formed in Martha's stomach. The scullery was the lowest post in the castle, a dark, steaming room where pots were scrubbed and grease was scraped, and no one ever saw the light of day. It was not a promotion. It was a burial. She found Mrs. Whitlow in the small antechamber off the great hall, a ledger open on the table before her. The older woman looked up as Martha entered, and her thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Ah, the king's new pet," she said, her voice sweet as spoiled wine. "I wondered when you would come down from your tower." "I have not asked to be moved to the scullery," Martha said, keeping her voice even. "No, you asked to sleep in the east wing. You asked to be served by the king's own fire. You asked for a great many things, it seems, without ever coming to me." Mrs. Whitlow closed the ledger with a snap. "A maid who serves in the east wing cannot also serve in the laundry. It would be unseemly. So I have arranged for a new suitable position for you." "I did not ask for a new position." "You did not have to." Mrs. Whitlow's smile grew colder. "The king may have a soft spot for orphan girls, but the castle is run by those who know where things belong. And you, my dear, belong where the dirt is deepest. You may spend your nights in silk sheets if you wish, but your days will be spent where you cannot trouble the people who actually matter." Martha's hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the calluses on her palms pressing against her fingers, the same calluses Edward had kissed. She wanted to say something. She wanted to explain that she had not asked for any of this, that she had only wanted to feel safe for one night, that she had not meant to take anything that was not hers. But she said nothing, because she knew with a certainty that sat heavy in her chest that Mrs. Whitlow would not hear her. The woman had already decided what Martha was, and no explanation would change that. She turned and walked out of the antechamber, leaving the ledger and the cold smile behind her. And as she walked toward the kitchen stairs, she felt the walls closing in around her again, the same walls she had thought she was leaving behind when she climbed those stairs to the east wing. The scullery was worse than she remembered. It was a low-ceilinged room beneath the kitchen, where the steam hung thick and gray, and the air smelled of old grease and burnt pots. Cook's apprentice, a boy named Samuel, flower in his hair, barely looked up as she entered. "You're the new one? Scrub till the bell. Then you'll be called for the evening pots." Martha nodded and reached for the first pot. She scrubbed for 3 hours. She scraped and scoured and rinsed until her back ached and her hands were raw and the water in the trough had turned a murky brown. No one spoke to her. The other scullery maids, 2 girls barely older than the orphans she had once cared for, kept their heads down and their mouths shut, as if she carried a sickness they might catch. She did not blame them. She would have done the same. Once. At the noon bell, a kitchen boy came down with a tray of bread and watered ale. Martha took her portion and sat on an upturned barrel, chewing the hard bread in silence. The steam clung to her skin. The sound of the kitchen above was muffled and distant, like a world she no longer belonged to. She thought about the east wing, about the fire that had burned all night, about the way Edward had kissed her knuckles and said, "Welcome home." It felt like a dream now, a memory that belonged to someone else. She was still sitting there, bread half-eaten in her hand, when the door at the top of the stairs opened and a shaft of cold, clean light fell across the scullery floor. A figure descended the steps, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a simple dark tunic instead of his formal robes. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes scanning the dim room until they found her. "Martha," Edward said, and his voice was low and rough as if he had been clenching his jaw for a long time. "Come with me." She set down the bread and stood. The other scullery maids had frozen, their eyes wide, their brushes forgotten in their hands. The king had never come to the scullery. The king did not even know where the scullery was. Martha walked toward him, her feet heavy on the stone floor. She did not look back at the girls who were staring at her, or at the steaming trough, or at the half-scrubbed pot that would still be waiting for her when she returned, because she knew, somehow, that she water. Think. Don't going to return. He did not speak until they were in the corridor above, out of the steam and the smell and the gray light. Then he stopped and turned to face her, and she saw the anger in his eyes, a deep, contained fury that she had never seen in him before. "Mrs. Whitlow reassigned you to the scullery," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And you did not tell me." "I did not want to trouble you." He let out a short, sharp breath. "Martha, you are sleeping in my wing. You are eating at my table. You are—" He stopped, his jaw working. "You are not a scullery maid. You are not a laundry maid. You are not any of the things she is trying to make you." "I am what I have always been," Martha said quietly. "I am an orphan from Stonebridge who washes clothes for her bread. That is what I am. That is what I have always been." "And that is what you wish to remain?" The question hung between them, sharp and sudden. Martha looked up at him, at the man who had remembered her across all those years, and she felt the words rising in her throat, words she had been holding back since the moment she saw his face in the great hall. "I do not know what I wish to be," she said, and her voice cracked. "I have spent my whole life learning to be invisible. I was good at it. It kept me safe. And now—" She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth to hold back the tears. "Now you are asking me to be visible, and I do not know how. I do not know what I am when I am not scrubbing. I do not know what I have to offer a king." Edward stepped closer. He did not touch her, but the space between them seemed to shrink, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "You have offered me everything," he said, his voice rough. "You have offered me the memory of a boy who was afraid. We can see date when no one else would. You have offered me your hands and your songs and the way you hum when you are nervous. You have offered me more in the last week than anyone has offered me in a decade. And you ask me what you have to offer?" Martha shook her head, the tears falling freely now. "I do not know how to be seen. I do not know how to be anything but what I have always been." "Then let me show you," he said. "Let me show you what you are when you are not scrubbing. Let me show you what I see when I look at you." She looked up at him, into the face of the man who had crossed a courtyard and descended into a scullery to find her, and she felt the walls around her heart cracking. Not breaking, not yet, but cracking, letting in the light. She opened her mouth to speak, but before the words could come, a voice echoed from the far end of the corridor. Mrs. Whitlow stood there, her face pale and pinched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "I was not aware that you had business in the lower kitchens." Edward did not turn. His eyes remained fixed on Martha. "I have business wherever I choose to have business," he said, his voice flat and cold. "And it seems I have been too long absent from the running of this castle. I will review the household assignments myself, beginning tomorrow." Mrs. Whitlow's mouth tightened. "Your Majesty, the household has been run in the same manner for 3 generations, and it will be run in a new manner, beginning tomorrow." He finally turned, and the look he gave her was not angry but absolute. The look of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed.
Martha will be reassigned to the East Wing as my personal attendant. She will answer to me and to no one else.
If you have a concern with this arrangement, you may bring it to me directly. Mrs. Whitlow's face went white. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then, with a small, stiff nod, she turned and walked away. Her footsteps echoed down the corridor, sharp and quick, like the retreat of a beaten army. Martha stood very still. The corridor was silent now, except for the distant sounds of the castle going about its business. Edward turned back to her, and the hardness in his face softened. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I should have made your place clear from the beginning. I should not have let her—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I am not used to having someone to protect. I am not used to having someone who matters enough that their position in the castle needs defending." Martha looked at him, at the vulnerability in his eyes, and she understood something she had not understood before. He was not just a king who had remembered an orphan girl. He was a man who had been alone for a very long time, and who did not know how to be anything else. "I am not used to having someone who wants to protect me," she said softly. "Perhaps we can learn together." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and folded. He held it out to her. It was a new apron. Not the coarse, gray linen of the laundry, but a soft, pale blue cloth, embroidered at the hem with small white flowers. It looked like something a lady's maid would wear, not a scullery girl. "I had it made for you," he said, "last week after you first came to the East Wing. I thought—" He stopped, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. "I thought you might like something that was not gray." Martha reached out and took the apron from his hands. The cloth was soft, impossibly soft, and the embroidery was fine and careful, each stitch placed with precision. She ran her thumb over the little white flowers and felt the tears prickling at her eyes again, but this time they were not tears of grief. She lifted her head and looked at him. "I do not know if I deserve this," she said. "You do not have to deserve it," he said. "You only have to wear it." And in that moment, standing in the cold corridor with the echo of Mrs. Whitlow's retreat still fading, Martha let herself believe that she could. She folded the apron carefully over her arm and said, "Then I will wear it tomorrow." Edward smiled, a small, real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Tomorrow, then," he said, and he offered her his hand, and together they walked back toward the East Wing. That night Martha lay in the soft bed with the lavender sheets, the blue apron folded on the chair beside her. The fire crackled in the hearth. The little harp stood silent in the corner, and outside the south-facing window, the moon rose high over a castle that was slowly, stubbornly beginning to feel like home. She was almost asleep when a knock came at the door. Not the heavy knock of a guard, but a light, deliberate rap. She rose and opened it to find a servant holding a sealed note. The wax bore the mark of Mrs. Whitlow's office. She broke the seal and read the few lines written in a sharp, cramped hand. "Be at the housekeeper's office at the Fad Bell. Your new duties require a formal oath of service. If you do not come, the king will learn what his little orphan is worth when she cannot even keep her own promises." Martha read the words twice. Then she looked at the blue apron on the chair, and she felt the warmth of it settle over her like a shield. She folded the note and placed it from the mantelpiece. She did not know what Mrs. Whitlow had planned for the morning. She did not know whether Edward would stand by her when the trap was sprung. But she knew one thing for certain now, with a certainty that sat deep and steady in her chest. She was not going to run. She was not going to hide. She was going to walk into that office at the third bell, wearing the blue apron, and she was going to see, at last, what she was made of. The third bell had barely finished ringing when Martha stepped into the housekeeper's office. The blue apron was tight and neckly over her plain gray dress, and she carried her chin at a level that she hoped looked braver than she felt. Mrs. Whitlow stood behind the heavy oak desk, and beside her, for the first time, stood a tall man in the dark robes of the King's Council. Martha recognized the silver chain around his neck, the mark of a senior advisor. She had never spoken to one before. "Ah, the new personal attendant?" Mrs. Whitlow said, her voice honeyed in a way that made Martha's spine prickle. "How punctual, how proper. I was just telling Brother Timothy here about your remarkable rise." Brother Timothy regarded Martha with pale, curious eyes. "The king's choice of staff is his own affair," he said slowly. "But when a maid of the laundry is elevated above the heads of 10 senior servants, the council naturally asks questions." Martha kept her hands folded in front of her. I was asked to give an oath of service, she said. I am ready to give it. Mrs. Whitlow smiled, and it was the smile of a cat that had already caught the mouse. She slid a heavy leather-bound book across the desk. Of course. But first, there is a small matter of verification. The council requires proof of identity for any servant raised to a position of trust. You understand. Martha looked down at the open page. It was a register, old and yellowed, with faded ink and the stamp of a charity house at the bottom of each page. Her eyes found her own name halfway down the left-hand column, written in a clerk's tidy hand, with the date of her arrival and a single word in the margin. Foundling. But beside that word, in a darker, fresher ink, someone had written another word. Imposter. The room went very quiet. Martha could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. I don't understand, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. This register is from the orphanage. It lists me as a foundling, that is the truth. Brother Timothy leaned closer. The annotation beside your name, he said, suggests that the record was altered, that you were never actually a resident of that orphanage, but paid someone to record your name there, to fabricate a past that would make you seem more pitiable, more worthy of the king's sympathy. Martha's breath caught. That's not true. I lived there from the age of 5. I remember the stone floors and Sister Agnes's soup pot and the crack in the ceiling above my cot. Memories can be rehearsed, Mrs. Whitlow said smoothly. Registers can be doctored. The question, my dear, is not what you remember. It is what you can prove. Martha felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had walked into the office expecting accusations about her work, her manners, her place. She had not expected this. She had not expected them to take the one true thing about her past and twist it into a lie. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. And in that silence, Mrs. Whitlow's smile widened, because she knew, as Martha was only beginning to understand, that the trap was not about whether Martha was lying. It was about whether anyone would believe her. The door to the office swung open with a force that rattled the inkpots on the desk. Edward stood in the doorway, still in his riding clothes, dust on his boots, and a hardness in his jaw that Martha had never seen before. I was told that my personal attendance oath was being administered, he said, and his voice was quiet in the way that thunder is quiet before it breaks. I was not told that it would become an inquisition. Mrs. Whitlow stepped back a half-pace, but she did not drop her eyes. Your Majesty, the Council's protocol requires— The Council's protocol, Edward said, does not require you to deface charitable registers with your own handwriting. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and looked down at the open page. His eyes moved from the word foundling to the word imposter, and then he laughed, a short, hard sound that had no humor in it. This is a copy, he said. The original register from that orphanage was burned in a fire in my 13th year. Everyone who worked there knew it. This is a forgery, made to look old with the original entries copied by hand and this little addition written in fresh ink. He turned to Brother Timothy. Tell me, brother, does the council usually accept documents with ink that still smudges at the touch? Brother Timothy touched the page, and his finger came away with a dark smear. His pale eyes moved to Mrs. Whitlow, and something in them hardened. Mrs. Whitlow's composure cracked just a hairline. Your Majesty, I merely thought— You thought to test her? Edward's voice dropped lower. You thought to see whether a girl from the laundry could stand in front of the King's Council and defend a past that you had decided to call a lie? You thought to break her before free her oath so that the Council would question my judgment. He straightened, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around him. But you forget something, Mrs. Whitlow. You forget that I knew her before she was a foundling on a register. I knew her when she was a girl of 8 with a scrape on her knee and a tangle in her hair, who shared her bread with a boy who had none. The silence that followed was so complete that Martha could hear the dust settle on the ledgers. Mrs. Whitlow's face went white. Your Majesty, that is— I was that boy. Edward said it plainly, without drama, the way a man states a fact that has cost him something to carry. I was the orphan who slept in the corner cot of that charity house, who learned to read from a torn psalter in the chapel, who was taken in by a merchant at the age of 11, and later found his way to the throne by means that are not written in any register. That boy lived with me in that orphanage, and this woman— He gestured at Martha, and his voice softened, almost imperceptibly.
This woman was the only one who ever made sure I ate. Martha felt a tear slide down her cheek, and she did not wipe it away. She had not known. All these weeks she had not known that the king she served, the man who had given her a blue apron and a place in his house, was the same boy she had fed from her own portion when they were both small and starving. "You never told me," she whispered. "I did not know how," Edward said, and for a moment he was not the king. But the boys she remembered, all sharp elbows and watchful eyes. "I did not know if you would want to remember me. I was not easy to love back then." Brother Timothy cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the council will need to verify this account. The records are gone, but there are witnesses. The merchant who took you in, the priest of the chapel."
"Arrange it," Edward said. "But the oath will proceed. Today. Now. Because I do not need a register to tell me who this woman is. I have carried her kindness in my chest for 20 years. Mrs. Whitlow stood frozen, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the floor. Martha saw the woman's shoulders tremble, and for a moment she felt something that was not triumph, but a strange and unwelcome pity. She turned to face the housekeeper. "I do not know why you hate me," she said quietly. "I do not know what I did to make you want to break me. But I am sorry that your life has made you so afraid of someone like me." Mrs. Whitlow looked up, and her eyes were wet. "You are nothing," she said, but her voice cracked on the word. "You are nothing, and you are being given everything. It is not fair." "No," Martha agreed. "It is not fair. But neither is it fair that I grew up hungry, or that the boy I fed grew up alone, or that you were made to spend your whole life serving people who never saw you." She took a breath. "None of it is fair, but I did not make your life hard, and you do not get to make mine harder because of it." The door opened again, and a servant's voice cut through the tension. "Your Majesty, Lord Aldrich of the Northern Marches has arrived. He requests an audience regarding the appointment of your personal attendant." Edward's jaw tightened. "Of course he does." He looked at Martha, and his eyes were warm even as the rest of him was steel. "It seems the day is not done with us yet." Martha lifted her chin. The blue apron felt steady around her waist. "Then let us see what he has to say." She walked out of the office at Edward's side, and behind her she heard Brother Timothy asking Mrs. Whitlow a quiet, pointed question about the provenance of the forged register. She did not look back. Lord Aldrich was a broad man with a grey beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. He stood in the great hall with his hands clasped behind his back, and beside him stood Elsbeth, her dark hair pinned in an elaborate coil, her eyes unreadable. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, bowing his head a fraction, "I hear that you have chosen a personal attendant from the laundry. I have come to ask whether this is a jest, or whether my daughter's services have been deemed insufficient." Elsbeth's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Her eyes moved to Martha, and stayed there. Edward met Aldrich's gaze without flinching. "Your daughter's services were never in question, Lord Aldrich. She is a fine lady, and any household would be honored by her presence. But my personal attendant is my own choosing, and I have chosen Martha." "For what reason?" Aldrich's voice was not hostile, but it was heavy. "Because she is kind?" "Because she was kind to you once, when you were both children. A king does not rule a kingdom on childhood memories, Your Majesty." "No," Edward agreed. "A king rules a kingdom on trust, and I trust this woman more than I trust any minister who has ever bowed to me." He paused. "She fed me when I was hungry. She did not know I would become king. She did it because she was kind, with no expectation of reward. Tell me, Leon Aldrich, how many of your advisers can say the same of the loyalty you receive?" Aldrich was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he inclined his head. "That is a fair point, Your Majesty." He looked at Martha, and his eyes were no longer cold but measuring. "You have chosen a rare thing, it seems. A servant who sits because of who she is, not what she hopes to become." Martha felt the weight of his gaze and did not look away. "I did not know he was the king, my lord," she said. I only knew he was a boy who was hungry, and I had bread." Elsbeth's expression flickered, something soft passing through it before it was carefully smoothed away. She looked at Martha, then at Edward, and for a moment she seemed to be seeing something she had not expected. "Father," she said quietly, "perhaps we should leave the king to his new attendant." Aldrich studied her, then nodded. "As you wish." He bowed to Edward. "Your Majesty, I will not be the one to stand in the way of a debt of honor, but the council will speak of this. Be ready." He turned and walked out, and Elsbeth followed, but at the threshold she paused and looked back at Martha. Her lips parted as if she meant to say something, and then she shook her head and was gone. Brother Timothy appeared at Edward's side, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, the council will require a formal hearing. Given the circumstances, the forged register, the public nature of the appointment, they will want to hear the full account of your time at the orphanage. And hers. It will not be a pleasant afternoon." Edward's jaw tightened. "Then we will have it," he said. "Summon the council for tomorrow at noon." Brother Timothy bowed and left. The great hall fell quiet, and Martha and Edward stood alone in the slanting light of the afternoon. "You did not have to say all that," Mother said softly, "about the orphanage, about me." "Yes," Edward said, "I did." He reached out, and for a moment his fingers hovered near her sleeve, not quite touching. "I have spent 20 years becoming a king," he said, "but I forgot that a king is only as strong as the people who knew him before he was strong. You are the only one left who remembers that boy, and I think I wanted them all to know that he was worth feeding." Martha looked up at him, and the words that had been tangled in her chest all these weeks finally came loose. "You were always worth feeding," she said, "even when you did not believe it. Even before you were a king. That is why I did it. Not because I expected anything, because you were worth it." Edward's breath caught, and for a moment he looked like the boy she remembered, all sharp elbows and startled eyes. And then he smiled. A real smile, and Martha felt something warm and steady settle in her chest. But the warmth did not last. From the corridor came the sound of raised voices, and a servant hurried in with a white face. "Your Majesty, the council has been summoned early. Brother Timothy is telling them of the forged register, and there is talk that the appointment must be postponed until the hearing." Edward's smile vanished. "Then we will attend the hearing," he said, "and we will let them see what they cannot forge and what they cannot break." He turned to Martha, and his eyes were steady. "Are you afraid?" Martha touched the blue apron, the weight of it, the memory of his hands placing it over hers. "A little," she admitted, "but not of them." "Then come," Edward said. "Let us show them what a foundling and a king can do when they stand on the same side." Martha walked beside him out of the great hall, and the weight of the coming hearing settled over her like a cloak. She did not know what the council would say. She did not know what old ghosts would rise from the ashes of that burned register, but she knew, with a certainty that sat deep and steady in her chest, that she was not walking into that heat, the erring as the girl who fed a hungry boy 20 years ago. She was walking in as the woman who had chosen at last to be seen. The king's council chamber was smaller than Martha had imagined, and far more crowded. Rows of wooden benches rose on 3 sides, filled with lords and ladies in heavy velvet and fur, their faces a blur of suspicion and curiosity. At the center, on a raised dais, sat Lord Aldrich, his silver beard combed tight, a scroll of parchment unrolled before him. Martha stood at the edge of the room, her blue apron freshly washed and pressed, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the burned register, the crumbling pages, the faces of the council members who would decide whether Edward's word, and hers, was enough. The doors at the far end opened, and Edward walked in. He wore no crown. He wore a simple tunic of dark wool, the same as the one she had first seen him in, and he walked past the rows of nobles without looking at any of them. His eyes found hers, and he gave the smallest nod. Martha felt her breath steady, just a little. Lord Aldrich raised his hand, and the murmuring of the chamber fell to silence. "We are gathered," he said, his voice carrying to every corner,
to examine the claim made by Mrs. Wicklow, late of the royal household, that the woman known as Martha, now serving in the kitchens, is not the person she claims to be. We are also here to examine the counterclaim of His Majesty, that this woman is in fact known to him from his childhood at St. Anne's Orphanage. Mrs. Whitlow sat on a bench near the front, her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller than she had in the great hall. Her dress was plain, her hair pulled back severely, and she did not look at Martha. She looked at the floor. "Mrs. Whitlow," Lord Aldrich said, "you have alleged that the register naming Martha was a forgery. You have since admitted in the presence of witnesses that you yourself altered the records. Is that correct?" Mrs. Whitlow's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes." "Speak up, woman." "Yes," she said louder. "I altered the records. I burned the original page and wrote a new one. I did it because—" She stopped, her jaw working, and for a moment Martha thought she would stop there. But then she lifted her head, and there was something raw and broken in her eyes. "I did it because I know what it is to be invisible," Mrs. Whitlow said. "I was not born to this life. I was a foundling too, left at the gates of a convent in the north. The nuns took me in, but they did not love me. They taught me to scrub floors and to keep my head down, and when I was 14, a lady of the manor came to choose a servant. And she chose me because I was quiet and obedient." The chamber was silent. Martha felt her own throat tighten. "I worked for that lady for 30 years, Mrs. Whitlow went on. "I never married. I never had children. I was always the one who knew where everything was, who remembered every birthday, who mended every tear. And when the lady died, her son turned me out without a reference. He said I was old and slow, and that he wanted someone prettier to serve his wife." She laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "So I came to the palace, and I worked here. And I watched the young ones rise past me. I watched them be seen. And this woman," she gestured at Martha without looking at her, "she is not young. She is not beautiful. She is a foundling, like me. And yet His Majesty looked at her and saw something. He gave her his own cloak. He gave her his own name to defend." Mrs. Whitlow's voice cracked. "I could not bear it. I could not bear that one foundling was seen, when I had spent my whole life being looked past. So I made it so that she would be unseen too, I thought. I thought if I could make them doubt her, then maybe I would not feel so alone." Martha stood very still. The anger she had carried for days, the righteous fury that had steadied her in the great hall, drained out of her like water from a cracked pot. She looked at Mrs. Whitlow, at the woman who had tried to destroy her, and she saw not a monster but a mirror, a version of herself that had never been fed by a hungry boy, never been seen by a king. Lord Aldrich's voice was heavy. "Mrs. Whitlow, you confess to forgery, to the destruction of a legal record, and to slander against a member of the royal household. These are serious crimes." "Yes," Mrs. Whitlow said, "I confess to all of them." The chamber erupted in murmurs. Lord Aldrich raised his hand again, and the noise died. "There is the matter of the king's own claim," he said, turning to Edward. "Your Majesty, you have stated that you knew this woman at St. Anne's Orphanage. The records of that institution were destroyed in a fire before you were taken in by a merchant. You must understand that your word alone, however sincere, is not a legal document." Edward rose from his seat. He did not look at the council. He looked at Martha. "I was 11 years old," he said, "when I stood at the gate of St. Anne's, holding the hand of a girl who was bleeding from a cut on her knee. I had been there for 3 days. I had not eaten in 2, because the older boys took my bread at every meal. I was too small to fight back, and too proud to cry." He took a step toward Martha. "That girl took my hand, and she slammed me to the kitchens, and she gave me half of her own bread. She did not ask my name. She did not ask where I came from. She just gave me bread, and then she sat beside me while I ate it. And she told me that the cook's dog was named Biscuit, and that he would bite anyone who tried to take my bread again." Martha felt tears prick her eyes. She remembered. She remembered the thin, hungry boy with the fierce eyes, and she remembered the dog, a mangy old terrier who slept by the hearth and growled at anyone who came too close. "She was 8 years old," Edward said. "She had a scar on her knee, and her hair was always tangled no matter how many times the nuns brushed it."
She told me she was going to be a cook one day, because cooks always had enough to eat, and she made me promise that I would come back and visit her when I was a man." He stopped, and the chamber was so quiet that Martha could hear her own heart beating. "I never came back," he said. "The merchant who took me in died when I was 19, and I refused his fortune because I did not want to be a merchant. I went to the border, and I fought, and I rose, and I was given a command, and then I was given a title, and then, by a twist of fate I still do not fully understand, I was given a crown. But I never forgot the girl who gave me bread. I never forgot her name." He turned to face the council, his voice steady. "I have no register to prove it. I have no document, no seal, no witnessed signature. All I have is a memory of a scar on a knee, and a promise I made to a girl with tangled hair. Is that enough? I do not know. But I know it is true, and I will stake my crown on it." Lord Aldrich was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Martha. "You have heard His Majesty's account. What say you?" Martha stepped forward. Her legs were trembling, but her voice did not shake. "I remember the boy," she said. "I remember the way he held his bread like it might be taken from him at any moment. I remember the dog, and the way the boy laughed when it growled at the older boys. I did not know he would become king. I did not even know his name until the day he came to the kitchens and I saw his face again." She paused, and she felt the weight of the room on her shoulders. "I have spent my whole life not being seen," she said. "I was a foundling, and I learned early that the best I could hope for was to be useful enough to keep. I did not learn to hope for more. But when His Majesty looked at me in the kitchens, he did not look at me like I was a servant. He looked at me like I was someone he had been looking for." She touched the blue apron. "I do not have a register either. I do not have a document. All I have is this apron, and the memory of a hungry boy, and the knowledge that when I gave him my bread, I was not being useful. I was being kind. And I think that is worth something." Elsbeth rose from her seat near the back of the chamber. She was pale, but her voice was clear. "My lords," she said, "I have known Martha for only a few weeks, but in that time I have seen her tend to the sick, comfort the frightened, and refuse to speak ill of the woman who tried to ruin her. I have seen her choose kindness when she had every right to choose anger. I do not need a register to tell me who she is." Lord Aldrich looked at Elsbeth, then at Edward, then at Martha. He was silent for a long, long moment. Then he said, "The council has heard the testimony of His Majesty, of the woman Martha, of Lady Elsbeth, and of Mrs. Whitlow. We have weighed the absence of written record against the consistency of spoken memory. We have considered the character of those who speak." He paused. "It is the finding of this council that the claim of His Majesty is credible. The woman Martha is recognized as a person known to him from his childhood. The council does not stand in the way of the appointment." The chamber erupted in noise. Martha felt her knees go weak, and she reached out instinctively, and Edward's hand caught hers, warm and steady. But Lord Aldrich was not finished. "However," he said, raising his voice, "this council does not forgive the destruction of records. Mrs. Whitlow, you have confessed to a crime. The punishment for forgery is severe." Mrs. Whitlow's face went gray. She closed her eyes. Edward stepped forward. "Lord Aldrich," he said, "I would ask the council to consider mercy." Lord Aldrich raised an eyebrow. "Mercy, Your Majesty?" "Mrs. Whitlow acted out of a wound that I understand," Edward said. "She was invisible for a lifetime. She saw someone like her become visible, and she could not bear it. That is not an excuse, but it is a reason, and I would ask that instead of punishment, she be given a chance to be seen in a different way." He turned to Mrs. Whitlow. "I am establishing an orphanage within the palace grounds," he said. "It will house the foundlings of this kingdom, and it will be run by Martha. If she will accept the post, I would ask you, Mrs. Whitlow, to serve there as well, not as a punishment, but as a chance to give to those children what you were never given." Mrs. Whitlow stared at him, her lips trembled. Your Majesty, I tried to ruin her. I tried to ruin you." "You did," Edward said, "and you failed. Now you have a choice.
You can carry that failure like a stone, or you can put it down and help me make sure that no child
think this kingdom ever feels as invisible as you did. Mrs. Whitlow's face crumpled. She did not speak, but she nodded. Once, and she did not look away. The council adjourned. The nobles filed out, their faces a mix of relief and curiosity. Elspeth caught Martha's eye as she passed, and she smiled. A small, genuine smile, and Martha smiled back. Martha stood alone in the center of the chamber, the blue apron still tied around her waist. She felt hollow and full at the same time, like a vessel that had been emptied of fear and filled with something she did not yet have a name for. Edward came to her, and he took her hand again. "You did well," he said. "You spoke the truth, and you made them believe it." "I did not make them believe it," she said. "I just told them what I remembered." "That is what truth is," he said. Memory, held steady, without flinching. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The orphanage. I meant what I said. I want you to run it. I want you to be seen, every day, by children who will know that someone like them made something of herself." Martha felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I do not know how to be seen," she said. "I have spent my whole life learning not to be." "I know," Edward said. "I will teach you, and you will teach them." He took a breath, and then he said softly, "But there is one more thing. I did not ask you to stay as a servant. I did not ask you to stay as a caretaker. I am asking you now, as the man who ate your bread and never forgot your name. Will you stay as something more?" Martha looked at him, at the king who had been a hungry boy, and she did not know what to say. The words tangled in her throat, and all she could do was hold his hand and let the tears fall. Edward smiled, and he did not press her for an answer. He think what stood with her in the empty chamber, while the afternoon light slanted through the high windows and the dust motes danced around them like tiny, golden witnesses. The afternoon light had shifted from gold to amber by the time Martha found her voice. Edward had not moved, had not pressed her, had simply stood with his hand in hers while the dust motes danced their slow, silent circles. She looked at their joined hands, calloused and worn in different ways, and she thought of all the bread she had broken for hungry children, and all the years she had spent learning not to be seen. "I do not know how to be something more," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have only ever known how to be useful." Edward turned to face her fully. "Then let me be the one who teaches you the difference." She looked up at him, at the king who had once been a boy eating stolen bread at her kitchen table, and she felt something crack open in her chest. It was not painful, not the way old wounds were painful. It was more like the first thaw after a long winter. "I will stay," she said. "Not because it is my duty, because I choose to, because you remembered me when no one else did, and I want to learn what it means to be remembered by you." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were bright. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "Then that is enough," he said. "That is more than enough." They stood in the empty chamber until the light turned to rose, and then to violet, and then the servants came to light the evening candles. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need. The words they had been carrying for years had finally found their way out, and what remained was a link, solid thing that did not require naming. The orphanage opened on the first day of the harvest month, in a long stone building at the edge of the castle grounds that had once been a storehouse for grain. The council had approved the repairs without argument, and Edward had personally seen to it that the windows were wide and the hearths were deep. Martha walked through the empty rooms the evening before the doors opened, running her fingers over the new wooden beds and the freshly whitewashed walls, and she allowed herself to believe that this was real. Mrs. Whitlow came to stand beside her in the largest dormitory. The older woman was quieter these days, her sharp tongue softened by something that looked like grief, or perhaps like the beginning of peace. She had not spoken much since the council chamber, but she had worked without complaint, scrubbing floors and sorting linens alongside the younger servants. "They are good beds," Mrs. Whitlow said, her voice rough. "Solid oak. They will last." Martha nodded. "The children will not have to sleep on straw," she said. "Not here." Mrs. Binton silent for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I slept on straw until I was 12. My mother used to say that if I worked hard enough, I might rise above it. I did rise, in a way, but I never stopped being afraid that someone would look at me and see the straw underneath." Martha turned to look at her. The woman's face was lined and tired,
And for the first time, Martha saw not the enemy who had tried to destroy her, but a fellow traveler on a long, hard road. "And now?" she asked. Mrs. Whitlow met her eyes. "Now I think perhaps I was so busy proving I was not the girl in the straw that I forgot to be kind to the girl who was still there." She wiped her eyes with
and sank of her hand. "I have no children of my own. I thought I did not want them, but I think perhaps I was just afraid to want something that could be taken away." Martha reached out and took her hand. "Then you will help me raise these children," she said, "and if you are afraid, you will learn, as I am learning, that some things are worth the fear." The first children arrived at dawn. There were 7 of them, aged from a small boy of 4 to a tall girl of 13, all of them quiet and wide-eyed and clutching whatever few possessions they had managed to keep. Martha greeted each of them at the door, kneeling down to look them in the eye and ask their names. The little boy, whose name was Tom, looked at her with a seriousness that broke her heart. "Is this really a place where we can stay?" he asked. "Or will we be sent away when the harvest is done?" Martha took his small hand in hers. "This is your home now," she said, "for as long as you need it. And I am going to teach you something that no one ever taught me when I was your age." "What is that?" Tom asked. "That your name matters," she said, "and that someone will always remember it." She led them through the building, showing them the dormitories and the kitchen and the small garden where they would grow vegetables in the spring. Mrs. Whitlow followed at a distance, watching, and Martha saw her pause beside the smallest girl and produce a piece of honeycomb wrapped in cloth. The girl took it warily, then bit into it, and a smile spread across her face. Mrs. Whitlow smiled back, and for a moment she looked younger. Edward came in the afternoon. He arrived without ceremony, wearing a plain tunic and no crown, and he found Martha in the kitchen, teaching Tom how to knead bread dough. The boy was covered in the think up to his elbows, and Martha was laughing at something he had said. Edward leaned against the doorframe and watched. He did not speak, and for a while, Martha did not notice him. When she finally looked up and saw him, her cheeks flushed, and she wiped her hands on her apron. "Your Majesty," she said with a small curtsy. Edward shook his head. "Edward," he said, "you named me at a kitchen table when I was 11 years old. I think you have earned the right to use it." Tom looked at them, his eyes wide. "Are you the king?" he asked. Edward crouched down so that he was at the boy's level. "I am," he said. "But once, a long time ago, I was a boy just like you, and I was hungry, and I was alone, and I did not know if anyone would ever remember my name." "Did someone remember it?" Tom asked. Edward looked at Martha. "Yes," he said. "Someone did. That evening, after the children had been fed and bathed and tucked in their new beds, Martha walked with Edward along the wall of the garden. The harvest moon hung low and golden over the fields, and the air was cool with the first hint of autumn. She had not planned what to say. She had never been good at planning words. But when they reached the far corner of the garden, by the apple tree that had been planted the same day the orphanage doors opened, she stopped and turned to face him. "I have been thinking about what you asked me," she said. "About staying as something more." Edward watched her, his face unreadable in the moonlight. "And what have you decided?" Martha took a breath. "I do not know what I am," she said. "I am not a lady. I am not a queen. I am a woman who spent her whole life hiding in kitchens because she was afraid to be seen. But I am learning." She reached up and touched his face. Her fingers tracy, thank the line of his jaw. "And I think I would like to learn it with you if you will have me, not as a servant, not as a caretaker, but as whatever we can become together." Edward covered her hand with his own. "Martha," he said, and her name sounded like a prayer. "I have waited a long time to hear you say that. I would have waited longer. If I had to, I would have waited forever." She laughed, a small, shaky sound. "You are too patient for your own good." "I am a king," he said. "I have learned that some things cannot be rushed. And you, Martha, are worth every moment of waiting." They stood together under the apple tree, and the moon climbed higher, and somewhere in the distance a night bird sang. In the orphanage, the children slept in their new beds, warm and safe. And in the kitchen, Mrs. Whitlow sat with the smallest girl, who could not sleep, and told her a story about a girl who had once slept on straw,
but had learned to be brave. In the morning, Martha rose before dawn and went to the kitchen to begin the bread. She hummed as she worked, a tune she had not sung in years, and when Tom came padding in with sleep in his eyes, she gave him a piece of dough to knead. "You are learning," she said, "and one day you will teach someone else." Tom nodded solemnly. "I will remember," he said. "I will remember every name." Martha smiled, and the sun rose over the fields, and the orphanage filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of children's voices. And when Edward came down from the castle, crownless and smiling, she did not curtsy. She simply took his hand and showed him the morning, and together they watched the children run through the garden, laughing under the golden light. That was the beginning. It was not the end of anything, because nothing that is truly alive ever ends. It simply goes on, like bread rising, like names remembered, like the warmth of a fire that is tended by hands that care. And Martha, who had spent her life learning not to be seen, stood in the doorway of the orphanage with the king at her side and let herself be seen at last.
Sometimes, a king's greatest strength isn't his crown, but his memory of the hands that once shared their bread. Martha believed she was invisible, but to Edward she was the only light in the dark. Would you have the courage to step out of the shadows if your past came looking for you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story warmed your heart tonight, please subscribe for more romantic tales by the fire.